Are you tired of feeling like you're always the one reaching out, always the one giving, always the one trying? What if I told you there's a powerful shift you can make right now that changes everything? No more waiting for him to validate your worth. No more letting silence define your value. In the next few minutes, we're diving into how you can take back your power and stop giving him the satisfaction of seeing you break. Stay with me, because this could be the turning point you've been waiting for. You saw his name light up your phone, and for a split second, your heart raced the way it always did. The familiar anxiety and excitement churned in your chest. The question loomed. Should you answer? Should you give him what he wanted again? And yet this time something felt different. As you stared at the screen, you felt a flicker of clarity. This wasn't a game of waiting for his attention anymore. It was a game of waiting for you to wake up. You realized that the power you'd been giving him wasn't actually his to take. It was yours to reclaim. He wasn't just waiting for you to answer. He was waiting for you to break, to chase after something that would never truly satisfy you, to prove that his control over your emotions was stronger than your own will to walk away. But you didn't respond, not because you were angry, not because you were playing hard to get, but because you understood for the first time that this was no longer a battle of who texts first or who gets the last word. It was about who was truly in control. And for once, it was you. This moment wasn't about a text message. It was about taking back the part of you that had been slowly fading with every unanswered call, every missed opportunity, every moment of silence between you. This time, when you didn't reply, you were sending him a message. You were showing him that the pieces of you weren't scattered anymore. You weren't waiting for someone to notice your worth. You were finally noticing it yourself. The truth you had buried deep within was undeniable now. You didn't need his validation to feel good enough. You didn't need his attention to prove you were worthy. What had been broken inside you wasn't something he could fix. What was broken was the idea that you needed him to complete you. You already were whole. For so long, you had defined your worth based on how much he wanted you, how often he reached out, how deeply he responded. But in this moment, when you didn't reach back, you realized the cold truth. He wasn't the one who made you whole. He was the one who made you question yourself. Every time you'd go to him for reassurance, you'd walk away feeling more empty. Every time he'd pull away, you'd find yourself chasing harder, hoping that something would change, that he would change. But what if the only change you needed was within you? What if the answer wasn't in texting back, but in recognizing that you had been waiting for him to come around? All the while forgetting to ask yourself, what do I need? It wasn't about the absence of a text message. It wasn't about whether he would react or whether he would chase you now. It was about the deeper realization that you had been giving up pieces of yourself, one message at a time. You had been choosing to abandon your needs, your feelings, just to stay in the game. But now, you weren't playing anymore. You weren't interested in the empty chase, the roller coaster of highs and lows, where your self-worth was determined by his words or lack thereof. You were breaking the cycle. For once you chose you, and that was more powerful than any text message could ever be. He wasn't waiting for you to respond. He wasn't waiting for the next text to fix whatever uncertainty he felt in himself. What he didn't know was that you were finally taking control of your own narrative. It wasn't about showing him that you could ignore him or that you were tough enough not to care. It was about reclaiming your energy, your confidence, your peace. Every time you waited for him to text back, you were putting your power in his hands. But the moment you stopped, the moment you didn't text back, you were putting that power back where it belonged, within you. He didn't get to decide your value anymore. You did. The satisfaction he expected was not one you were willing to give him anymore, because you had learnt the hard way that no one should have the power to break you unless you let them. You realized that you had been playing a game with no real winner. The game of waiting, of doubting, of questioning whether you were good enough. And each time you texted him back, You were feeding into this endless loop of insecurity because his actions never seemed to give you the reassurance you needed. So you were left always wanting more, wanting him to be something he was never going to be. But what if you were the one who had to change? What if you didn't need his words, his actions to define your worth? What if the only validation you needed was from within? In that moment, when you didn't respond, you realized that you didn't need to play by his rules anymore. You were the one who got to decide how this story would go. You're not breaking by choosing silence, you're breaking free. It's easy to think that breaking silence means admitting defeat, or that breaking away from the cycle means giving up. But it's the opposite. You're not giving up on him. You're giving up on the idea that your worth depends on his attention. You're giving up on the idea that your happiness is tied to his actions. You're realizing that your strength doesn't come from keeping him interested or playing the game of back and forth. Your strength comes from choosing to stand tall, to stand firm, even when everything around you seems uncertain. You don't need him to confirm your value. You've already realized that your value was never his to confirm. This isn't just about not texting back. It's about stepping into a new version of yourself, a version that's not chasing anyone's approval, a version that knows how to walk away when something doesn't serve her, when someone doesn't respect her, when the relationship isn't healthy. The moment you didn't text back, you were making a statement without saying a word. You were telling yourself that you didn't need his validation to feel good enough. You were telling him that you were no longer going to chase something that wasn't right for you. You were telling the world that you were worthy of more than crumbs, and you knew that you were better off alone in your own power than with someone who made you feel small. For weeks, you had been the one reaching out, always wondering why he wasn't responding with the same enthusiasm. You had questioned yourself, wondering if it was something you said or something you did. Every silence from him left you spiraling into self-doubt, into wondering whether you were good enough or if you were simply not worthy of his attention. The more you tried, the more distant he became. You found yourself investing more energy into someone who barely acknowledged your efforts. But then something changed. One day you simply decided to stop chasing. You stopped texting. You stopped checking your phone every 5 minutes, waiting for the notification that he had responded. And in that moment of silence, you began to hear something far more powerful than his words ever could have been: your own voice. The voice that had been drowned out by your need for his validation, now louder and stronger than ever. The silence was no longer a void. It was the space you needed to find your own strength. The first day was the hardest. You could feel the temptation to reach out, to say something, anything to bridge the gap between you two. The old habits were hard to break. But as the hours passed, and you didn't pick up your phone, something extraordinary happened. You began to realize that you weren't dying without his response. In fact, you were breathing deeper, thinking clearer. Your mind wasn't clouded with worry about what he might be thinking. You stopped assuming that your happiness was linked to his actions. The more time you spent without him in your thoughts, the more you realized how much of your life you had been wasting, waiting for someone to give you a piece of what you already had inside you: self-worth. You had spent so long waiting for him to fill a void, not understanding that you were the one who had the power to fill it all along. By the second day, it wasn't just easier, it felt liberating. You weren't waiting for him to come back around anymore. Instead, you started to see your worth from a perspective you had long forgotten. You realized that you weren't the one who had to prove something here. He was. He was the one who needed to see the value in you, not the other way around. The role you had been playing for so long, the one where you were the one reaching out, trying to make everything work, was no longer necessary. You started to understand that relationships aren't about fixing someone else, or waiting for them to change, or constantly wondering what you did wrong. You can't pour from an empty cup. You had been giving so much of yourself only to receive little in return. But now, without any effort, you were feeling more full, more complete. You were starting to see the truth that had always been there. You didn't need him to fill the spaces in your heart. The more time passed without you reaching out, the more you felt his absence. But strangely, it wasn't the same kind of longing you had experienced before. It wasn't the kind of yearning that made you feel like you needed him to survive. Instead, you felt a sense of freedom that you hadn't known in a long time. The weight of his absence wasn't crushing you anymore. It was giving you room to breathe. It was allowing you to rediscover who you were before you started chasing after someone who wasn't reciprocating. And for the first time in ages, you were beginning to enjoy your own company again. You found yourself doing things that you loved, hobbies that you had neglected, and you realized how little time you had spent truly appreciating yourself. In the silence, you found your peace. The world felt lighter. The burden of chasing him had finally been lifted, and in its place was a sense of liberation. Then came the day when you finally let go of the last bit of hope that he would suddenly change. You let go of the idea that he might eventually see the value in you. You let go of the idea that he would one day wake up and realize how much you had given, how much you had cared, how much you had loved him. The truth hit you hard and clear. He wasn't the person you had hoped he would be, and it wasn't your job to try and make him into someone he wasn't. You were not responsible for his emotional growth or for him recognizing your worth. And in that realization, you finally saw that the only person you needed to focus on was yourself. You could no longer wait around for someone who wasn't showing up for you. The love you had for yourself was the only one you could count on to keep you grounded, and it was the only one that truly mattered. As time passed, the shift in you became undeniable. You were no longer emotionally tethered to his indifference. The craving for his attention started to fade, and it was replaced by a deep sense of self-respect. You had stopped seeing yourself through his eyes. You stopped measuring your worth by his actions. You stopped wondering whether he would come around. You didn't need him to see how incredible you were anymore. You already knew. The clarity you gained from stepping back was like stepping into the sunlight after being trapped in the shade for so long. You could finally see the big picture. You could see that you were worthy of someone who would give just as much as you did. Someone who would value you, respect you, and appreciate the love you had to offer. And that person wasn't him. When he finally reached out, it wasn't the same. The texts didn't hold the power they once did. The thrill of a response no longer made your heart race. You weren't waiting for validation anymore. His words, his actions, they no longer defined how you saw yourself. You had redefined your own worth. You had learnt that the best way to make someone notice you is not by chasing after them, but by living your life in a way that draws people to you without you having to lift a finger. And as you reflected on how far you had come, you realized the true transformation had nothing to do with him at all. You have been through it all. The emotional roller coaster that came with giving your heart to someone who couldn't give it back in the same way. There were nights when you cried yourself to sleep, your tears mingling with the thoughts of how he could be so distant, so unresponsive. It wasn't just the silence that hurt. It was the uncertainty. It was the wondering whether you'd ever be enough. You had invested so much into him, emotionally, mentally, and even physically, hoping that one day it would be reciprocated. But instead, it was a constant cycle of disappointment, of waiting, of being let down again and again. And in those darkest moments, you thought about him. You thought about how much you cared, how deeply you felt, and you wished for him to see you, to feel the same way. But no matter how much you wanted it, nothing changed. Until one day, in the quiet of your room, you reached a breaking point, not one that destroyed you, but one that built you up. You broke, not into pieces, but into the realization that you were strong enough to survive it all. It was in the midst of the tears, in the isolation of your own sadness, that you started to see something incredible happening. Every tear you shed wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a sign of your resilience. In the moments when you thought you couldn't take another second of wondering why he didn't care, you realized that you were not breaking. You were breaking free. The tears were washing away the old version of you, the one that thought love had to hurt, the one that thought you had to prove your worth over and over again. You were no longer the person who needed to beg for someone's attention. You didn't need his validation to feel whole. In those quiet moments of pain, you started to reconnect with yourself, to understand that your worth wasn't tied to his indifference. You began to reclaim the pieces of yourself that you had given up for him. And you realized you were becoming stronger with every tear that fell. As the days passed, you started to feel a shift. The constant ache of longing, the need to make things work, began to fade. You stopped checking your phone every 5 minutes, waiting for a message, waiting for a sign. You began to stop caring about whether he would reach out. You weren't ignoring him out of anger or spite. You were simply letting go of the emotional weight he had placed on your shoulders. The weight that had made you feel small, that had convinced you that you weren't enough unless he recognized it. As you stopped chasing, you started to realize that you had been living in a state of emotional dependency. Your happiness had been tied to his actions, his responses, and his attention. But now, with the space between you, you could breathe easier. You could feel the shift within you, the shift from desperation to self-sufficiency. You realized that you didn't need him to be happy. You were learning to create your own happiness. The more time passed, the more you understood just how much of yourself you had lost in the chase. You had forgotten what it was like to enjoy your own company, to focus on your goals, your dreams, your desires. You had spent so much time trying to meet his expectations, trying to make him see you in a certain light that you had forgotten the most important thing, seeing yourself. And now, in the silence that had once been unbearable, you began to hear your own voice again. You began to rediscover your passions, your strength, your worth. You weren't just surviving, you were thriving. You found yourself diving back into things that made you happy, whether it was a hobby, a career, or simply enjoying a quiet moment to yourself. You realized that you had been running on empty for far too long, giving so much to someone who wasn't willing to give it back. Now you were finally starting to fill yourself up again. You were learning that your peace didn't depend on anyone else's approval. It came from within. There was something incredibly empowering about not reaching out anymore. At first, it felt like a risk. You wondered if he would ever notice. You wondered if he would finally see the effort you had put in, the care you had shown. But as time passed, you realized that the only person who needed to notice was you. You were no longer waiting for his acknowledgement or his recognition. You were recognizing your own worth. And in that recognition, you found your strength. You realized that love wasn't about constantly seeking someone's approval or trying to fix a relationship that was broken. Love was about respecting yourself enough to walk away when it wasn't right. You weren't waiting for him to come to his senses. You were learning to trust yourself, to believe in yourself, and to let go of someone who wasn't willing to give you the same respect. The silence between you two had become a reflection of your newfound peace, a peace that came from the understanding that you didn't need anyone's validation to know you were enough. And then, after days of reflection, you realized that the person you were waiting for wasn't him, it was you. You had been waiting for him to change, for him to see how much you cared, for him to realize that you were the one who could give him everything he needed. But what you hadn't realized was that you had been waiting for someone who wasn't ready to meet you where you were. And you didn't have time to wait for him to catch up. You realized that your time your energy, and your love were far too precious to be spent waiting on someone who didn't appreciate it. You had so much to give, and it was time to give it to yourself. You were no longer going to be defined by the relationship that didn't nurture you. You were going to be defined by the strength you found in the silence, the strength you found in yourself. Finally, the day came when you looked back, not with regret, but with pride. You had gone through the pain, the tears and the heartbreak, but you had come out on the other side stronger than you ever thought possible. You no longer needed him to complete you. You didn't need him to validate your worth. You had learned how to validate yourself. You had learned how to find peace within, to embrace your own strength and to move forward, knowing that you were worthy of the love and respect you had always given to others. You were no longer waiting for anyone to come around because you had finally come around to yourself. You had found your power, your peace, and your strength. And that was the greatest reward of all. You had spent so much time hoping, waiting, and wishing for something that you couldn't control. Every call you made, every text you sent was an attempt to get him to see you, to get him to understand how much you cared. But no matter how much you gave, it never seemed to be enough. The silence between you two wasn't just uncomfortable, it was crushing. It made you question your worth, your actions, and everything that had led you to this point. You started to wonder if it was you, if you were somehow doing something wrong, not saying the right things, not acting the way he needed you to. But the truth was, you had been so focused on him, on making him see you, that you stopped seeing yourself. You had been so desperate for his attention that you forgot to give yourself the attention you deserved. You were trapped in a cycle of seeking validation from someone who wasn't capable of giving it to you, and it was exhausting. The more you reached out, the more he withdrew. It became a pattern, one that hurt more with each passing day. The texts went unanswered, the calls went unreturned, and the doubts in your mind grew louder. Why wasn't he responding? Was it something you did? Or was it simply that you weren't enough? The silence echoed in your mind, creating a narrative that made you feel less than. You began to second guess every move you made, every word you said, as though his indifference was a reflection of your own inadequacies. It was in those moments of doubt that you realized something. His silence wasn't a reflection of you. It was a reflection of him. It was a reflection of his inability to see your worth, to recognize the love you were offering. And in that realization, you began to understand that you had been chasing after something that wasn't even willing to meet you half. As the days passed, you began to feel the weight of all the emotional energy you had poured into this one-sided relationship. It was draining, suffocating even. You had been trying to make it work, trying to fill a void that could only be filled by someone who was willing to be there for you just as much as you were willing to be there for them. But it wasn't happening. You weren't getting what you needed, and no matter how many times you tried to reach out, it wasn't going to change. The truth was harsh, but it was necessary. You couldn't keep waiting for him to come around. You couldn't keep giving pieces of yourself to someone who wasn't willing to offer anything in return. You needed to stop waiting for his acknowledgement to feel good enough. And in that moment of clarity, something shifted within you. You realized that you didn't need him to validate your worth. Your worth was not contingent upon his attention or affection. Your worth was already established. You started to notice the small ways you had been ignoring yourself, putting your own needs on the back burner, sacrificing your time, your energy, and your peace for someone who couldn't meet you where you were. You had been waiting for him to give you the things you needed, but in the process, you had stopped giving them to yourself. You had forgotten to check in with your own heart. to ask yourself what you needed, what you deserved. You had been chasing him, hoping that something would change, hoping that if you gave more, he would start giving too. But it didn't work. He couldn't meet you halfway because he wasn't capable of meeting anyone halfway. And as hard as it was, you realized that you needed to stop chasing. You needed to stop wasting your energy on someone who wasn't able to see your value. You deserved more than that. You deserved someone who would give you the same effort you gave to them, not someone who left you wondering where you stood. As time passed, you began to feel a sense of freedom that you hadn't experienced before. The constant need to check your phone, to wait for a response, to wonder where he was and what he was doing started to fade. You no longer found yourself trapped in the cycle of hoping and waiting. Instead, you started to focus on yourself. You started to see all the things you had neglected, the hobbies, the friendships, the dreams you had set aside. You began to realize that your happiness didn't depend on him. It never did. It depended on you. And when you shifted your focus from trying to fix something that wasn't working to nurturing yourself, everything started to change. You began to rediscover the things that brought you joy, the things that made you feel alive. The weight of waiting for him to change was lifted. And in its place was the lightness of knowing that you didn't need anyone to complete you. You were complete as you were. You began to understand that it wasn't about playing games or trying to teach him a lesson. It wasn't about showing him that you could be the one who didn't chase, the one who didn't care. It was about recognizing that you had already given enough. You had already shown up. You had already loved deeply. And now it was time for you to show up for yourself. You didn't need him to see how much you cared, because in that moment you saw how much you cared for yourself, and that was enough. You didn't need to wait around for someone else to validate your worth. You didn't need him to come around and recognize all the things you had given. But the truth was, you didn't need him at all. What you needed was to give yourself the same love, the same attention, and the same respect that you had been giving him. And when you did, you started to see a new version of yourself. One that was strong, self-assured, and confident. The more you focused on yourself, the more you began to heal. The wounds that had been created by the constant chasing, by the silence, by the uncertainty, started to close. You no longer felt the need to prove your worth to anyone. You didn't need his attention, his approval, or his love to feel complete. You had everything you needed inside you. You were no longer dependent on someone else to fill the void that was only meant to be filled by you. You started to realize that you were worthy of someone who would meet you halfway, who would offer you the same love and respect that you were giving. And the more you focused on yourself, the more you realized that you had been giving your energy to the wrong person. You had been chasing someone who wasn't able to give you what you needed, and now you were taking back that energy, putting it into yourself, and in doing so, you were creating space for someone who would truly appreciate you for who you were. In the end, you learned that the most powerful thing you could do wasn't to wait for him to change, to wait for him to recognize your worth. The most powerful thing you could do was to stop waiting altogether. You stopped waiting for him to meet you where you were, and instead you decided to meet yourself there. You stopped waiting for someone else to validate you.